Facebook and how it protects its users is again under scrutiny. A UK charity has discovered that police in the UK recorded 5,120 child grooming crimes on apps owned by the company since 2017. According to the research, which was published by children's charity, the NSPPC, 53% of all online grooming crimes took place on Facebook platforms, including Instagram and WhatsApp, amounting to 24 incidents per week. Andy Burrows, the head of Child Safety Online Policy for the NSPPC, joins me now. Andy, it's probably not surprising, these statistics, but incredibly worrying.
Incredibly worrying. And I think what it really shows is that in the 4 years since we saw new grooming offences come onto the charge sheet, the scale and complexity of online sexual abuse against children has continued to increase. And as those figures have continued to increase, then, it's the same old story that we're not seeing the tech giants do enough. When we dig into these figures in a bit more detail, what we can see that's particularly concerning is Instagram, and both the number of offences and the proportion of overall offences that are taking place on Instagram has continued to surge during the last 4 years, which really underlines that on the Facebook service, which is used most frequently by children, there's a really significant problem that Facebook are really failing to get to grips with.
I mean, have big tech essentially created a perfect storm here? Because it sort of set in motion this trend of, especially girls, but not always girls, but pouting for the camera and posing in, pretty seductive ways, considering their relatively young age, and amassing lots and lots of followers and living for ticks and likes and probably attracting unwanted attentions and at the same time being a little bit too naive to really understand the real world effects of that.
Well, the one thing that we can't forget here is that when children are using social networks like an Instagram, like a Facebook, they are children and they are inherently vulnerable as a consequence of that. And we all have an expectation that in the offline world, we will have safe environments for children. So, if your child goes to the playground, that's a fundamentally safe space for them to be. If they go swimming, there will be lifeguards to make sure that they're safe. What we haven't seen on social media, despite the fact that it's such an important part, for better or worse, of children's lives, we know that the majority of children have social media accounts before the age of 13. We haven't seen an attempt to make sure that this is a fundamentally safe space. And where you're talking there about things like likes, design choices that are designed to try and nudge children into posting certain types of content or to spend longer on the site, they are driven by commercial motivations. They are not driven by a primary consideration about, if we're doing design choice A or B or C, is that in the best interest of the child? And that's why we need to see the government step in with a really ambitious online safety bill, because unfortunately we've seen time and again that the best that we can hope for from the tech companies themselves is piecemeal action after the event in response to personal tragedies. And that simply isn't good enough when we're talking about children's safety and well-being.
And this is a topic that I cover a lot on this programme, because it strikes me that there's a whole litany of offences being committed on social media. I mean, you can go down the route of these filters that are encouraging people to look artificially unlike themselves. And we've now had to put legislation in place to stop under 18s from having cosmetic surgery. You've had recent reports lately of drugs being pushed online. You've got content showing people how to self-harm or even encouraging people to commit suicide. There's, of course, bullying. There's adult content, which is regularly being put in front of young children. And yet all I ever hear when I say to people, what's the solution to this, is, well, we really need to start by educating our kids at school. But surely that's not enough. I mean, the World Wide Web is plunging children into a very adult world and surely compromising their innocence.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And parents and teachers and professionals, we all have a responsibility, a part to play to help to make sure that children are safe. But that cannot be left to parents, as it has been over the last decade or so, while we see tech firms really failing to live up to their responsibilities and to make sure that platforms are fundamentally safe for children. And, you were talking there about things like content that promotes suicide and self-harm. Let's be really clear about what some of that content does. If you think about the type of influencer style accounts that you will see on Instagram, some of the content that I see in my job is kind of twisted versions of influencer sites that are recommending ways to cause harm to a child through self-harm, through suicide ideation. This is not stuff which is defensible on freedom of expression grounds. It is harmful content. And it's not only that this breaches the terms and conditions of platforms, but the platforms then sit on their hands and don't enforce the rules properly, is that the algorithms will kick in and target vulnerable children. So if you're thinking about, say, a vulnerable teenage girl who once or twice might look at that content, the algorithms kick in. They're not assessing, is this good content or bad content? They're simply assessing that the teenage girl in question is viewing that content. And so perhaps they want to see more of it. And so that's how then you get to a situation where every time a teenager opens up a social media account, there will be more of that content at the top of a timeline. And clearly that is, something which carries really significant risk for our children and young people. And it's because the platforms are not having a set of requirements to make sure that children's safety isn't just an optional extra. It has to be, a legal requirement that if they're serving children, offering products to children, they have to be safe for them.
I mean, it's interesting because I'm doing a special today as part of my broader programme into AI. And for this, I did a lot of research into the developments of AI and the innovations. And I'm left in no doubt, actually, that there are tools that big tech can use to prevent harms taking place and prevent, for instance, young people being approached by far older people, and to put in things such as age verification. Why do you think this is not being done? Why is it? I mean, we've now got Facebook dragged in front of the Parliamentary Select Committee to answer questions, but there doesn't seem to be an appetite to clamp down on social media when we know it causes a huge amount of damage, especially to younger people. What's going on and why aren't people talking out about this?
The simple reality here, Alex, is I think that for a long time, in the absence of this being a legal requirement and in the absence of there being a commercial driver to act to really get on top of the problem, the platforms haven't done enough. They've been able to look at statistics like the grooming data that we're releasing today and to dismiss that as a bad news cycle. And so at best, we see, kind of piecemeal action after the event. We see very targeted action. We haven't seen a comprehensive root and branch focus on prioritising children's safety. Now, it's not because, the companies are evil. It's not that they don't care about children. It's simply that children's safety has not been a core part of the business model. So, Facebook in the last few days have been proclaiming the fact that they've spent $13 billion in the last 4 years on trust and safety. And I don't want to be churlish. That's a significant amount of money, but that's 4% of their turnover during the years that they're giving those figures for. And 4% of turnover to tackle a problem which is becoming increasingly pernicious for children and young people, never mind the range of other societal harms. So, we need to see action which corresponds to the scale of the threat that our children are facing, and we just haven't seen that so far.
Let's have a look at what Facebook have said in response to this. They said this is abhorrent behaviour and we work quickly to find it, remove it and report it to the relevant authorities. We also block adults from messaging under 18s they're not connected with and have introduced technology that makes it harder for potentially suspicious accounts to find young people. Do you buy any of that? Does that sound like enough? Because clearly these things are still taking place regularly.
Well, they have done some of those things, most recently to comply with new UK regulation, which has come in. So, they're taking credit really for something that they have to do to comply with the law. But let's take another example. So Facebook wants to roll out end-to-end encryption of its messaging services. Now that, let's be clear, can have benefits for all of us in terms of privacy. But it also means that if they roll out end-to-end encryption, before there are technical mitigations in place, then at a stroke, 70% of child abuse reports will be lost. That will mean that thousands of children that are safeguarded every year, thousands of child sex offenders that will go to prison because of crimes they're committing on Facebook sites, that will no longer happen. Now, 130 global child protection organisations led by the NSPPC wrote to Mark Zuckerberg 18 months ago, asking him to build those technical mitigations and to commit to only proceeding with this, very high risk design choice once those mitigations were in place and it can be proven that they've worked. Now, 18 months later, we still do not have any set of reassurances from Facebook that they are prepared to do that. So at the flick of a switch, when they have this ready to go, that will mean that we go back to the digital dark ages in terms of child abuse. And what does that say about the priority of Facebook, of children versus wider commercial imperatives? Unfortunately, time and again, if there's a trade-off between children and commercial or adult imperatives, children lose every time. And that can't be right.
I mean, we heard in the news yesterday, Australia actually wants to implement parental consent for minors to access social media. We have forthcoming in the UK, something I'm really anticipating, the online harms bill. Do you think that online harms bill could be a seminal moment here to finally turn the tide? And would you want to see something like the policy Australia hopes to introduce put in place here?
So the online safety bill can be a game changer if there's the political will to make sure that this meets the very simple objective that we've laid out for it, that this legislation does everything that is proportionate and reasonable to prevent the type of harm that we're seeing, and harm that is inherently preventable. So we'd really encourage the new Culture Secretary, Nadine Dorries, to seize this moment, because there's the opportunity with this legislation to protect a generation of children. This can become a crucial part of the child protection landscape that can serve us for decades to come. That is a question really of political will. And when we see the way in which tech firms have failed so often to put children's needs front and centre in their design choices, it's why this now has to be a legal imperative, not, as it is right now, an optional extra as to whether or not we see children being protected.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.